So it's interesting to me on the heels of what was a very, very tough and ugly debate for President Biden. A lot of folks just ignored the other guy standing next to him, which was a complete crap show. But 60% of voters said Biden should be replaced as a Democratic candidate. But then when asked to the next question, who would you vote for president? 45% said Biden, 45% said Trump.
In that morning consult poll.
In that morning consult poll. So it says to me that that first number is just a visceral reaction. They sort of, oh my God, no, we can stand in that. But the next one, you sort of take the step back and you actually have to then think about the choice. So if he was so bad up top, why would you then say give him the vote on the bottom side? Tells me bad debate, but there's still a lane for Joe Biden to make this race. That's why I was saying before, everybody needs to chill the hell out, re-coordinate, refocus, and let the man just go to the country and make his case.
I mean, I am thinking about that debate, and yes, we've talked a lot about the president's performance and how it did not meet the bar that the campaign themselves had set for their own selves. Right. And I'm just thinking about some of the things I heard Donald Trump say. I mean, we talked about black jobs and Hispanic jobs, his false claims on abortion. He said that Nancy Pelosi refused 10,000 troops on January 6th. And then Nancy Pelosi's response the day after was like, he thinks I ordered my own assassination. Like, he took credit for the pandemic recovery. He ain't even the president, and he lied so flawlessly. I was just kind of like, wait, what did he just say?
Yeah, that was what he did.
I also had a question about the fact, as far as I could tell, they have not previously asked this question. So
in the morning consult poll.
So it is possible that for a long time there have been a large number of Democratic voters that if you polled them and asked them specifically, would you prefer to see another candidate? Do you think you should drop out? Would have said that prior to this debate.
Yeah, right? I mean, they were saying it in other polls.
Right. And yet the fact remains, to your point, that when you say, okay, but now we're not living in a theoretical, we're living in the actuality of these two candidates, right. Make your choice. All of a sudden, those numbers are not.
I would like to be a size 6. If you polled me and asked me, would I like to be a 6? Consistently, I would say yes. Okay, but am I a 6? No, baby. No, baby. I'm not a 14, but I'm not a 6. And, if we want to be a 6, there's some work we got to do to be a 6. We're not going to be a 6 before the summer. Y'all not going to have a new nominee before November.
On the 6s. Oh, my God.
Okay, so, Instagram told me differently on both topics.
Oh, yeah, they did. Instagram, maybe Instagram. Yeah, Instagram. There's no magic pill you can take.
Is this a size?
Is this a 6?
Is this a 6?
Mr. Chairman, you look good.
To take you.
Whatever it is, you look good. You look good, okay? And let me just edit myself. There is probably a pill you could take to be a 6 before the summer, but there's not a political version of that, y'all.
Exactly.
So live in the reality, people.
It is a crucial weekend for the Biden-Harris campaign as they try to address widespread concerns coming out of Thursday night's debate. Vice President Kamala Harris was in the battleground state of Nevada Friday afternoon. Harris offered a staunch defense of the president.
Earlier today, the president said himself it was not his best performance. We believe in our president, Joe Biden, and we believe in what he stands for. Listen, we've got 130 days, I'm counting, until Election Day. 130 days. And this race will not be decided by one night in June.
Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Robert Garcia. Welcome, Congressman. I think the Vice President makes a very important point. The big freak out Thursday night even stunned me. I mean, in politics, it's so immediate, so fast. And we were talking with former Lieutenant Governor Barnes about the fact that, on the Republican side, it's like, oh, we're good. Our guy's a criminal, we're good. Our guy's a sexual predator, we're good. Democrats, oh my God, he slurred a word. What?
Well, he didn't just slur a word. It was a bad performance.
I'm not going to take away from that. I got it. It was a bad performance, and it didn't meet anyone's expectations. But the thing that amazes me is just the immediate decision by so many in the party to just go, okay, I'm done. I can't do this. Explain some of that. I don't understand the thing, because on my side of the aisle, we're like, hunker down, get the press release out, close the doors, we're going to work it out. When we go outside here, we're going to steamroll.
Alicia, Michael does like to beat up on the Democrats. I'm just saying, he's warranted here.
Brings back warm memories.
Yeah, brings back warm memories from his chairman days.
I mean, look, I think what the reaction is essentially that people are obsessed, all of us Democrats, with beating Donald Trump. We know that democracy is on the line.
Right.
We know that the future of this country and our institutions are on the line. And so we are invested. We are all in to ensure that we beat him. And so, of course, we want to make sure that our debates are perfect. We want to make sure that the president performs at his very best. And so, of course, when the president has a raspy voice or is not taking on maybe Donald Trump the way we'd like to see it, some people are going to get nervous. But let's be crystal clear. Donald Trump is a liar and lied over and over and over in that debate. And President Biden told the truth. He was honest. He showed the kind of man that he is. He took on Donald Trump on the issues that he needed to take him on. And I am proud of our president. Democrats have rallied around our president. We are with him 100%. We saw that performance in North Carolina. We know that the president can deliver a message and take it to Donald Trump. And I'm fired up. We are going to win in November, and the party right now is united behind our president.
Let me ask a more specific version of Michael's question, which is, it's not Democratic voters necessarily who are freaking out. It is party establishment. So what do you say to the fellow members of your caucus who are the ones on background with reporters saying that they're looking for an alternative?
I would tell them, look at the grassroots fundraising. With the hours after the president left the debate stage, grassroots fundraising surged. We actually raised more money for that debate than we've raised in this entire cycle. Look at that. The grassroots, the people that I'm talking to, they're backing up the president. We have the president's back. And so I would say to those folks, hey, it's fine. Not every day is going to be perfect, but let's focus on the big picture, which is defeating the most dangerous person to ever run for president or be the president is Donald Trump. That's the focus. Get on board. We're all there. We support the president.
This point about the grassroots, I think, and the voters is an important one. And we are still, that's why in the immediate aftermath of the debate, I really wanted to know what some of the focus groups were saying, those dial tests, right? Like the as I like to call the regular, real people, right? Who were like, how did they glean this? Mm-hmm. There was a focus group in Michigan that said they felt like Joe Biden won, and I was like, oh, that is okay. This is what real people are thinking in some places. And it harkens back, I think, to lots happened this week. Jamal Bowman lost his primary this week in New York, and one of the most effective attack ads against Democrats this cycle in a primary is that they undermine the Democratic Party agenda and they don't support the president. We've seen that in a number of races, and folks that have shored themselves up against that, like Summer Lee in Pittsburgh, same attack was lobbed against her, but she had establishment party endorsements. There were folks from the president who said that, like, look, she works with. They rallied around her, and she was able to blunt that. You juxtapose that with what we're hearing from some of the operatives and some of the elected officials, and it's kind of like we're living in two different worlds. Greg Meeks said in NBC News to our colleagues that he, in terms of the president, had a bad night, and he said, I think he's going to have to put himself out there more. I understand people are rallying around the president in the Democratic Party base in terms of the voters. Do you think, though, that there are any changes that the campaign should make?
Well, look, the campaign's always going to make changes. I mean,
But what are some of the changes you think they might should?
No, I think the campaign's rolled out a really effective strategy. I mean, obviously, I think that putting the president out with his supporters, like they did in North Carolina, was electric. Getting the vice president out there like they're doing is motivating the base. They're doing the work. And I think what your point, Simone, about the grassroots and the impression of the debate is important. It's not just voters in Michigan. There was also a focus group post-debate around Latino voters. These Latino undecided voters, and Univision and other networks participated in this focus group. Latino voters overwhelmingly thought that Joe Biden won the debate because they're hearing someone that's telling the truth. They're hearing Donald Trump attack migrants in the debate. They're hearing Donald Trump say that immigrants somehow create an uncivilized country, which is a quote from the debate, versus a man who stands up for working class people, for immigrants, for Latinos, for the entire community. And so the grassroots, the base of the party, what they saw on that debate, unlike some of the political chattering class, is a man who is honest, who tells the truth. Yes, he might be a little bit older and wiser, but he has the experience. That's our nominee. And one last thing. There's one person in this country who has defeated Donald Trump. and his name is Joe Biden, and he's going to do it again.
But that's an important point. There's no doubt about that. But I really think the strategist in my side of my head looks at this, and immediately after the debate was on our programming and made the point, and I think it was an important one, that this president was not served well in preparation for this debate. This president was put in an untenable position to do something against someone that would be largely ineffective. All Joe Biden had to do was be prepped to say, when every time Donald Trump finished the sentence, look at him and say, "You're a liar," and move on. Filling his head with data, trying to connect dots and do
that closing statement about taxes.
Right, exactly. Just let the man be in a space where he can emotionally connect to the American people as he did in North Carolina the next day.
That's right.
That's the guy who should have been on the stage in the debate.
But you're saying he needed to be freed up to be that guy.
He needed to be freed up, and so this heavy-handed preparation, a week long of debate prep against Donald freaking Trump? Are you kidding me? Why do you need a week to prep against the guy?
Well, I'm going to defend candidates doing debate prep. I don't care if you're a mayoral candidate, a congressional candidate, a president. People need to prep.
You're talking to someone who's
I'm just
been
saying,
in the room.
everybody is not you. You don't need
No. I'm just saying. No, I'm not saying you don't need a week to do what we saw. You don't need a week to do what we saw.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's what I'm saying. Because they overestimated of something who was standing opposite Joe Biden. And so I don't know if there'll be another debate, but I think to your point, Congressman, the more Joe Biden is on the ground in coffee shops, walking the malls, going to the neighborhoods, and being with real people and talking about real jobs, not black jobs or Hispanic jobs, whatever the hell that is, and connecting to people, I think that's going to be the thing that saves him with the American voter, who may right now be sitting there going, I'm not so sure.
Put a pin in that thought real quick. I want to take a listen to President Biden at Stonewall on Friday night. Get your reaction. Then we'll go.
This beloved bar became the site of a call to cry for freedom, dignity, and equality and respect. You marked a turning point in civil rights in America. You inspired the hearts of millions of people around the world.
That's what's at stake.
Absolutely. I mean, look, the president understands what's at stake. He understands that there is a choice for voters this November, and it's serious. It's one of actually moving our country forward, or one where our democracy is going to be at risk. We're LGBTQ plus people, we're people of color, we're working class people, we're union members are at risk. Donald Trump is the most dangerous candidate ever in the history of this country for the presidency. We saw that at the debate. And let's talk more about Donald Trump's performance. He lied and lied and lied, could not tell the truth one single time, and the fact checkers are saying that now. So I think at the end of the day, that debate, the president, obviously, they need to know what they know what they need to fix moving forward. But Donald Trump reinforced that he's a liar, and I think focus groups and post-debate information and polls are going to show that.
Congressman Robert Garcia, as always, so good to have you at the table. Thank you.
Happy to be here.
The Supreme Court sided with a January 6th rioter this week, ruling that a law criminalizing the obstruction of an official proceeding does not apply to his actions or the actions of other insurrectionists. Now, the Democracy Docket notes this means sentences could be adjusted for hundreds of January 6th defendants who have already been convicted. Joining us now is the founder of Democracy Docket, Mark Elias, and former federal prosecutor Ankush Khardori. Ankush is a senior writer for Politico magazine. Mark, can you just expound upon your Democracy Docket piece right there? What the heck did the Supreme Court do this week as it relates to this particular case?
Yeah, look, I think the most important story of the week, and I recognize there's a lot of other politics going on, may very well be that the U.S. Supreme Court undercut one of the main prosecution tools that the Department of Justice has used to prosecute January 6th defendants at the same time that Donald Trump took to a debate stage and refused to commit to abide by the outcome of the 2024 election. This case involved the application of what I thought was a very straightforwardly worded statute that made it a federal crime to obstruct an official proceeding. And a majority of the Supreme Court interpreted that, given its history and the structure of the statute, to only apply in instances where that obstruction involved documents or records or other tangible items, and it very well may lead to the dismissal of a number of charges and resentencing of individuals, including the dismissal of charges against Donald Trump. Now, it won't undo those cases in their entirety in most instances, and it won't undo the case against Donald Trump in its entirety, but it sends a powerful signal right now to a bunch of people who are planning to subvert the election in 2024 that they may just be able to get away with it.
Your point was taken up actually by Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who broke with the conservatives this week, noting Fisher's alleged conduct, which includes trespassing and a physical confrontation with law enforcement, was part of a successful effort to forcibly halt the certification of the election results. Given these premises, the case that Fisher can be tried for obstructing, influencing, or impeding an official proceeding seems open and shut. So why does the court hold otherwise? Anush, why does the court hold otherwise?
Because they are completely
I'm sorry, but yeah, you're right.
They are completely opportunistic textualists among the Republican appointees. I agree with Mark. This should not have been a close call, legally speaking. It is worth noting that Justice Jackson joined the majority here, so we shouldn't be just totally one-sided about it. But I do think the correct way to read this law was for it to apply to all of the people that it's been applied to. However, I will just say that on a note of optimism, I think the practical impact of the ruling is likely to be much narrower than I think people currently think, because the most obvious application of this decision would be to people who had only charges under that statute and who are still either yet to be sentenced or have time remaining on their sentence. I think when all is said and done, the number of people who sort of fit in that category, meaning that a judge would actually have to resentence them, and that would materially affect a reduction in their sentencing. I think we may be talking dozens, not hundreds.
But how about for Trump specifically?
For Trump specifically, I would also be less worried about this for two reasons. One, the theory that well, it's not a theory anymore, it's the law, that this statute has to apply only when there's sort of evidence or documentary impairment. The January 6th indictment the Justice Department brings alleges that with respect to the electoral certificates and the so-called false electors, right? So even within the confines of the Supreme Court's decision, the Justice Department's prosecution would arguably meet the standard. Even if it did not, even if that statute, for some reason, the charges got dismissed, or if the Justice Department dismissed them, which they will not do, all of the evidence that would be available or relevant to those charges would come in under the other charges anyway. The other charges that are pending under Section 241 and Section 371, those are the other charges pending against Trump. So practically speaking, all of the same evidence, all of the same conduct would come before the jury if this case goes to trial, and I'm dubious that it would, if there's a conviction, materially affect the outcome.
Yeah.
I know that there's more. I mean, I was struck. Mark said that this was quite possibly one of the most important decisions that was made this past week, and I was scanning the socials and reading through things yesterday, Mark, and it was the president and co-counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, President Nelson, and she said that it is notable that the court declined to hear McKesson versus Doe, which was the case that and left in place a ruling that basically said a protester, in this case, someone who is aligned with the Black Lives Matter movement, can be, anonymous, held accountable for the actions of other protesters, and police officers can essentially sue them. So they didn't want to take that up, but they decided to take this up. Why even decide to hear this case? What is the calculation here?
Simone, you're putting front and center, I think, something that is just not focused on enough. This U.S. Supreme Court heard just about 60 cases last year. Okay, out of tens of thousands of potential cases that they could have heard, they chose 60 of them. They chose a case to allow January 6 defendants to have charges, make it harder to prosecute them. They chose a case that involved Donald Trump's immunity, which by delaying the ruling in that, taking the case and delaying the ruling, they effectively conveyed immunity by delay and preventing him from having a trial before the election. they chose a number of other cases that allowed them to advance the Project 2025 initiative that you so eloquently dismantled the author of last week on the show. And what cases didn't they take? Right? They didn't take the cases that would protect the civil rights and the civil liberties and the voting rights of millions of Americans. And it is through that choice of what they take and what they don't take that the Supreme Court can do the bidding and the business that puts in peril so many things in this country that we worry about are being imperiled by another Donald Trump term.
What they take on Kush, what they don't take, and then what they move with great speed and what they slow walk.
Well, yes, and I noticed they all of a sudden got very patient and cautious with the abortion cases this year. Funny how that works. It's an election year, and they seem to have decided to kick the can on that, on those decisions, which I suspect if they were to come out the way the Republican appointees want would cause another political firestorm in this country.
I wasn't even thinking of that. I was thinking just of the fact that we still don't have an immunity ruling.
Oh, well, there's that, too. That's absolutely correct. I mean, they've slow-walked that. As you know, we talked about this before. There should have been a summary affirmance of the D.C. Circuit's opinion. In this case, we shouldn't have taken this long at all. I share everyone's frustration and anger about where it's currently situated, and I'm prepared on Monday for an opinion that is going to be very disappointing and perhaps even enraging. But you're exactly right. I mean, and I just want to say I have one little sort of nit to pick with a lot of commentary about the Supreme Court, which is about, vote counting. Is it a 3-3-3 court or 6-3 court? That is just an artificial exercise because the point that Mark made and that you identified is the exact right one. They pick what cases fall within the universe of the cases that they resolve. So you just have to, one by one, judge them on their merits, and I share the concerns people have.
And to that point, that would explain why the court tossed out the claim that the Biden administration coerced social media companies, where that injunction would have limited contacts between government officials and social media companies. Again, the big setup, folks, because now if the Trump administration comes on the back end, free reign between that interchange between social media and government.
Well, tomorrow, the Supreme Court will rule on one of Donald Trump's delay tactics to escape accountability for trying to steal the 2020 election. The justices are finally set to release their decision on the scope of presidential immunity, saving this crucial case until the very last day of their term. Now, Trump's federal election interference trial has been on hold since the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case in February. The delay has made it almost certain that Trump will not face a jury before the 2024 election. Oh, goodness. I got questions. People got answers. Joining us now with those answers is Tim Hafey, the former lead investigator on the January 6th House Select Committee. He also served as a United States attorney for the Western District of Virginia. And Marcus Childress, also a former January 6th committee investigator. And Tim, I hear you were Marcus's boss, okay? Marcus is in the box down here.
That's a tall order. Hi, Marcus. Hope you're doing well.
Hi, Tim.
So can someone just explain for us here at the table and the folks at home what we can expect tomorrow in the Supreme Court? It's not just immunity that they're going to rule on, but that's the one that we're looking for. Marcus, what say you?
So I'm really interested, and I'm sure Tim is, on the immunity hearing. I expect that we're not going to have a decision that says that there's absolute immunity for presidents. But the real line is going to be, what are the lines that the Supreme Court draws for the test that the lower court has to follow? If we look at the Blessing-Game opinion, which is another January 6th opinion for Trump, for example, maybe they say that the lower court has to determine what's an official act that's prosecutable. The reason why this is important is because there are clear facts that show that President Trump was not acting as the president at the time, former President Trump. He was acting as a campaign person, such as when he called Secretary of State in Georgia or when he was sending the fake electors to the city, to D.C. But it's the facts where he's maybe putting pressure on Vice President Pence or putting pressure on the DOJ, where there's argument that those are official acts that should not be prosecutable. So I'm really curious to see how the court draws those lines for the lower court. And then I'll be even more curious to see how the lower court actually acts on the decision that we get from the Supreme Court tomorrow.
It's interesting, Tim, this idea that hovers around whether Donald Trump was acting in his official capacity and what does that really look like in the scope of what a president does in a 24-hour period. Let's listen to some conversation between Justice Elena Kagan and Trump's attorney, Sauer.
The defendant asked the Arizona House Speaker to call the legislature into session to hold a hearing based on their claims of election fraud?
Absolutely an official act. For the president to communicate with state officials on a matter of enormous federal interest and concern, that's an official act.
Well, attempting to defend the integrity of the election, I mean, that's the defense. The allegation is that he was attempting to overthrow an election.
So I just started a very basic point, Tim. I cannot recall at any point in American history where a president of the United States calls state officials about his election. I mean, you have other people who would do that. So there was clearly Donald Trump using his office to try to, as Elena Kagan says, attempt to overthrow an election. How do we take this aspect of what this case really hinges on, official acts?
Yeah, it's a good question, Michael. The elections, as you know, are really the function of state government. It's states under our constitutional system that manage elections. And the Trump lawyer argument is that the goal essentially makes this an official act, right? The interest, the broad federal interest in the conduct of free and fair elections. It can't be simply that the goal is what determines whether something's an official act. The theory here from the special counsel, which I think is consistent with the evidence we found, was that the former president consistently stepped out of his official role, attempted to unduly and intentionally influence otherwise lawful proceedings without any evidence that there was actual election fraud, and propagated theories that had no basis. So I think Marcus is right that the Supreme Court here likely articulates some sort of standard that might separate what is immunized official conduct, clearly within the realm of what is appropriate for the President of the United States versus what isn't. Special counsel will present a lot of evidence that much of the conduct charged or all of it is outside. That then becomes a question for Judge Chutkan to sort out in some sort of pretrial proceeding before the trial begins.
Simone, I have a question, but I want to know what your face is saying.
Well, my face is just saying, what would be an official act that would be covered that is a crime? Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about crimes being covered. And so in what universe is the Supreme Court saying, now, if you do this and you're the president, yeah, we're going to let that one go?
I think to Tim's point, I think the Supreme Court will just want the lower court, Judge Chutkan, to make those determinations on paper, right? So have the special counsel's office put the evidence out to show that these crimes don't fall under official acts, and then get a ruling that makes the American public feel comfortable before the court's going. Before we even get to the next, what I'm really also curious to see is if there's going to be a per curiam or even a 9-0 decision. I thought one of the most impactful parts of our committee under Tim's leadership was the bipartisan nature of it, and I think that gave our committee more credibility in the public sphere. And when we saw with the Colorado case, right, it was unanimous, and there was a lot of concurring opinions. It was a unanimous decision. We saw it in the D.C. Circuit, a per curiam order of the court. I hope that the Supreme Court can do something similar tomorrow so that we're not sitting here next week talking about, whether this was politically motivated or whether there might be some other motives with the decision that comes out. And so that's actually my honest hope when it comes to the institutions of our country, is that we can have some type of unanimity with the decision tomorrow. Yeah. But I'm also not very hopeful about that as well.
Well, especially, Tim, because this isn't just about looking backwards at what happened on January 6th and the run-up to January 6th. It's about looking forward to this upcoming presidential election. I want you to take a listen. Former President Trump was asked repeatedly about accepting the results of this forthcoming election at the recent debate. Here's his answer.
The question was, will you accept the results of the election, regardless of who wins? Yes or no, please.
If it's a fair and legal and good election, absolutely. I would have much rather accepted these, but the fraud and everything else was ridiculous.
Not fraud that would have changed the outcome of the election. I think it is really telling, Tim. First, he's asked about it 3 times. He comes back to that answer 3 times. Also, that he says if it's a fair and legal and good election, he can't answer this question, yes or no.
No, it's a completely circular response. I'll accept it if it's fair, which of course means he'll never accept it because he'll say it's not fair. There was no evidence in 2020 that the election was unfair, yet the president continues to say that it was, and really tellingly raise money, lying to people, saying that it was. So you're exactly right. This decision not only has a huge impact retrospectively, but prospectively it sets a standard that will be applied in the future. And to Simone's good question about what could be criminal that's official, I think the court is worried about things like a president authorizing a drone strike, right, in his or her official capacity that results in a civilian death, and there could be some subsequent criminal charge. I think you could see things like that be classified as immune because they are clearly done in official capacity with no intent to commit a crime. That's a pretty narrow universe, though. So I think almost assuredly there will be some post-Supreme Court litigation that keeps the special counsel's case alive.
It's interesting to me, Marcus, where this decision puts everything else. Jennifer Rubin of the Washington Post, talking about the future of the trial, noted, if Trump's January 6th trial speeds ahead, as U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkan will be seen as meddling in the election. If she holds off until after the election, it will be clear the Supreme Court already did Trump's bidding. Right. We're in this space. I just don't know how Chief Justice Roberts allowed his court to be in this position in the first place. For someone who's talked about keeping us, we're the umpire. We want to call balls and strikes. We want to be separate from it. How do you see this, off of this decision, this all going forward? Because I think at the end of the day, the Supreme Court will have done Trump's bidding. Yeah, so when this decision comes down,
I expect there's going to be an evidentiary hearing of some sort. Tim touched on it a little bit earlier, and I think it happens in a lot of cases that Tim and I have tried in our careers. Is if there's a question of fact of applying a legal standard of what fact should come into the court, you have an evidentiary hearing where prosecutors will basically present the facts and proffers of what witnesses will bring certain facts in and how it supports the charges, and the court can make a ruling from that point on whether it's allowed to come in and for what purpose, or whether there's limiting instructions. And so in a way, this evidentiary hearing could be a little bit more damning than a full trial, because prosecutors are putting out all the facts that they feel are relevant for the trial, and you don't have to worry about tainting a jury pool. But I expect Judge Chutkan is going to move forward, probably applying whatever standard the Supreme Court puts out tomorrow, have an evidentiary hearing where she hears all the evidence and facts that the prosecutors want to have, and then she makes a ruling about what can come in and then for what purpose. And with the media, everyone's sitting in there and it being live tweeted out, I mean, that can be a pretty historic evidentiary hearing that will happen before the election, even if you don't have a trial before the election.
Right. Well, stay tuned, as they say, right? Marcus Childers, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you. I don't get it, but Democrats are split on the best path forward for Biden to beat Trump in November, with some entities calling for Biden to drop out of the race. Former Republican Stuart Stevens says Democrats should stop panicking, writing in the New York Times, quote, "Of all the Democratic pearl clutchers, the most disappointing and offensive are the Barack Obama insiders who can't bring themselves to do what Mr. Biden did for their old boss. Cover his back and fight. We have two MSNBC political analysts here to discuss, hosts of the Fast Politics podcast, Molly Jong-Fast, and former press secretary to VP nominee Paul Ryan, Brendan Buck. It is so good to have you in the house. Brendan, what a Democrat. What are they doing? I mean, how hard is it to stand by your man in the face of the assault that they know is coming and has come from Republicans, and just sort of rally around? What's your assessment of not only what you saw Thursday night, but the reaction afterwards? And how does that hurt their efforts going forward?
I mean, I think rallying around makes sense if this was just 90 bad minutes, as Anita Dunn was trying to tell you folks yesterday. That wasn't just 90 bad minutes. That was the worst debate anyone has ever seen that reveals some very deep-seated problems that they have. A candidate who is clearly he didn't just walk into some rhetorical traps and just have a bad night. He showed what we have seen for a very long time. This is a person who has significant cognitive issues that they've been lying to us about for a very long time. And so they want us to pat them on the back for saying that he had a rough night and then immediately pivot to telling us that this was no big deal. This was a big deal. And so I think it would be irresponsible to not take a minute. Everyone sees what we saw with our own eyes, what we've been thinking we've been seeing for a long time, and they've been telling us we haven't been seeing, and say, okay, let's reset. is this realistic that we can have this person, A, beat Donald Trump, but also how is he going to perform in the job 2, 3, 4 years from now? I mean, talk about somebody who has to go in and have a, he couldn't handle this debate, the opening question. It wasn't even like they were in a heated back and forth.
It was
the opening question.
It was a very bad
This is the person who's going to go sit down with Vladimir Putin, or even like our European allies, and come to a diplomatic outcome. Clearly, there is a substantive problem, and then there is a political problem, and I think they need to at least acknowledge that before just blindly moving on and saying this is our guy.
So, Molly, I mean, respond to Brendan Buck here. Do you think? I'm about to put it on Molly. Molly, respond to Brendan Buck here. Do you think that there's a cognitive issue with the president? One, and then the other point I want to pull out from what he noted is that how is he going? The question of like sitting down with Vladimir Putin. European leaders. We did just see the president in France and Italy, like he was at the G7. Yeah. But what do you think? Are you in the Brendan Buck camp? Are you over here with the Pod boys? Because that's who Stuart Stevens talking about. My friends from Pod, Save America. I love you guys, but
I'm with Michael Steele and Stuart Stevens here. When I say you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, I think it's very nice that Brandon, who is a Republican, feels that Joe Biden isn't necessarily up to it. I would love to see Republicans talk about their own nominee with all the criminal charges like that, but they never did, right? Democrats are the party of like feelings and, we need to be 100%. Look, man, I actually believe he has a stutter. It was not a great debate. It was a weird debate in a hermetically sealed room. The Republican was bragging about how he had the cleanest H2O. And, the winner of that debate was Donald Trump because he was able to say truly insane things. And nobody noticed because everyone is so fixated on Joe Biden. Look, I think Democrats are being held to a different standard here. Is he, is the base still with him? It seems like they are. Look, if we see hundreds of polls that show that they don't like him anymore and that they have lost faith in him, okay. But he had bonkers fundraising numbers. You have people who are angrier at editorial boards than they are at Joe Biden. Republicans are like slaves to their base, right? They do whatever their base wants. Here are Democrats who have a base and they want something and they have this good man and maybe he is not a gifted orator. And I would add, he has never been a gifted orator and maybe voters like him because he's not a gifted orator.
So I have one follow-up to throw something else in here and then I'm going to shut up. My book was No You Shut Up. I'm going to shut up today.
Yeah, never, Simone. Please no.
So we actually just got word that apparently the Biden campaign has raised $33 million since the debate. So I'll put that on the table. I hear Brendan, I hear Molly saying, look, they need to stand by their man. I hear Brendan being like, I saw what their man was doing. I want to throw this on the table. If in order, let's just say, I do not think that this is going to happen. I don't think there's any reporting that also suggests this is happening. Anita Dunn yesterday told us, and the president said on the stage himself, he is in this race. Yeah. Okay, but if Joe Biden says he is not going to be, there's only two ways Joe Biden is not going to be the nominee. The first way is that he himself says he's not going to be, or the second way is there's some revolt at the Democratic National Convention prior to where people are whipping thousands and thousands of delegates to go against what they have pledged to do, to go against what their states have done because Joe Biden won the delegates in these primaries, to then pick some new random nominee. Right. What is the scenario that people are looking for to sack Joe Biden? Is that the conversation? Are people really saying you have to seriously consider getting rid of the president? Or are people actually saying they want to see a course correction and a change? I'm trying to understand what the conversation is. Like, Brendan, are you saying that people really need to get rid of the guy?
I'm saying that they need to at least consider that. I mean, I think they need to look at some data and see.
What's their alternative?
I think the alternative is clearly Kamala Harris. I mean, I think they need to look it would be very hard for them to pass over Kamala Harris at this point. That would require the president to basically stab her in the back and run with somebody else, and I don't see that happening. But I think they need to look very hard at whether she would poll as well or better than him. Look at some data right now. I'm not saying you have to get rid of him. I'm saying you need to at least be open to the idea.
Molly said, okay. Molly, chime in.
I mean, the whole, Republicans never were like, let's look at Donald Trump, right? Nikki Haley's still getting 20-30% of the ghost vote when she's not even, in these primaries. And they're like, we love our guy. He wants to give us clean H2O. I think this is ridiculous. look, he's not a gifted orator. It was not a great debate. The next day, he killed it. Did he kill, the crowd, whatever? I thought the debate was really weird. It was like this hermetically sealed Star Trek. And also the other thing is, like, you get up there sometimes when you have a stutter, and I have done this myself. I don't have a stutter, but sometimes I meander. And I have, like, freaked out and been like, oh, no, I am crashing and burning. So I did not think this was, like, cognitive decline. The guy is incredibly old. We see this in the polls. Voters know he's incredibly old. But, there's a narrative here where they've counted him out before. I even wrote a piece in 2020 after he lost the first two debates where I said, if you can't win, you shouldn't stay in. Well, you know what happened? Voters picked him, right? In North Carolina, James Clyburn came and endorsed him, and then voters went and picked him, South Carolina. And so I think if voters want him, they should have him. The idea that the elites know better than voters, I think is nuts.
All right, folks, welcome back to the weekend. Editorial boards in two battleground states are weighing in on the future of the 2024 race. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution argues, quote, it's time for Biden to pass the torch. But the Philadelphia Inquirer says it's Donald Trump who should quit. Quote, the sooner Trump exits the stage, the better off the country will be. President Biden insists he's staying, and he's going to stay in place. But NBC News has learned he is expected to discuss his campaign's future with family members at Camp David today. This trip was planned before the debate, and sources tells NBC that this is not a, quote, formal or determinative discussion. All right, joining us now, House Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries. Leader, it's a great pleasure to welcome you.
Yes, thank you for being here this morning, sir. Good to see you. Thank you for getting up with us. Okay, Leader Jeffries, I want to start by asking you about this. There's this headline in the New Republic that reads, did Hakeem Jeffries just open the door to replacing Biden? It notes that you didn't answer directly when asked whether President Biden was the Democratic Party's best messenger. I know that you posted on social media Saturday that a setback is nothing more than a setup for a comeback vote. Would you like to respond to this assertion that you may have opened the door? Like, where are you? Just make it plain for folks, please.
Well, thanks for asking that question. I think it was an unnecessarily sensational headline, but that's the moment that we exist in. I've been very clear that it was an underwhelming performance on Thursday during the debate, as President Biden and his campaign have acknowledged. It certainly was a setback. But, of course, I believe a setback is nothing more than a setup for a comeback. And the reality is Joe Biden has confronted and had to come back from tragedy, from trials, from tribulations throughout his entire life. So the moment that we're in right now is a comeback moment, and it's going to require all of us to lean in, articulate a forward-looking message as to why the Democratic platform is best equipped to deal with the challenges facing the American people, beginning with making sure that every single person in this country has economic opportunity and the ability to experience the American dream.
Leader Jeffries, when we talk about the chattering class, in part what we're talking about are members of your caucus who've been speaking with the press on background about their questions about President Biden's candidacy. What do you say to members of your own caucus who are expressing this concern?
Well, we're in the process of having conversations with various parts of the House Democratic Caucus. That's ongoing. That will continue. We are in recess next week for the 4th of July holiday, so we'll have to have those conversations over the phone and virtually, and we'll continue to do that. But one thing should be clear. There is a big difference between our view of the world, the country, and the future, and the extreme MAGA Republican view. We know that President Biden is a good man, an honorable man, and a hardworking family man. We're running against a con man who lied his way through the entire debate on Thursday, lied about COVID, lied about the economy, lied about Roe v. Wade, lied about January 6th, lied about prescription drug pricing, lied about veterans. It was extraordinary. So this is a dangerous moment that we confront. It's an all-hands-on-deck moment. We've got to lean in articulating that clear contrast on the economy, on democracy, on reproductive freedom. And that's the mission that's in front of us over the next few days, next few weeks.
Speaker, I want to shift gears.
Oh, you called him Speaker. Look at you.
I'm sorry.
Look at you forecasting.
Where'd that come from? Where'd that come from? Leader Jeffries, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the Chevron ruling this past week, where basically you had Justice Elena Kagan, in her dissenting opinion, note that the court is seizing power for itself from federal agencies, where now the court will be the arbiter of what works, doesn't work, what the regulations should say or not say. How are you assessing that ruling in light of congressional power? Because this really is, in many respects, sir, a pull to the court, where the court is going to decide what the EPA rules should be, or the court's going to decide what some of the financial markets, how they should look. They're not experts. How does Congress respond to Chevron?
Well, the court has once again demonstrated that it is part of a right-wing effort to jam their extreme ideology down the throats of the American people in ways that are increasingly becoming undemocratic. Because, Michael, as you've pointed out, that Congress, particularly the House, designed as the institution closest to the people, and the Senate, of course, elected to be representatives of the American people, should have the ability to determine and set public policy outcomes that can then be interpreted or put into place by the executive branch. Not unelected judges with no accountability, because the constitutional fabric gives them lifetime tenure. And so I think we're going to have to make sure that as we proceed moving forward with consumer protections, combating the climate crisis, protecting the health and the safety and the economic well-being of the American people, that we proceed with the precision necessary to avoid extreme right-wing judges on the federal bench misinterpreting our intentions and thereby undermining our ability to look out for the American people.
Leader Jeffries, I'm sorry, Alicia.
No, go ahead, Simone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Leader Jeffries, I mean, just along these lines of the Supreme Court, are you concerned about what they could potentially do on Monday, that they have held this immunity decision from Donald about not just President Trump, but the presidency writ large until the end of the term? Because it seems to me that they've either decided that the president can be a king or a queen, and they just wanted to wait and tell us until the last moment, or they've decided that the president is not a king nor a queen, and they don't want Donald Trump to know until the last possible moment.
Yeah, it's very concerning, and I understand why there's a high degree of anxiety, because this should be crystal clear. America is not a monarchy. We're not an autocracy. We don't have kings or rulers or dictators. We are a democracy. In a democracy, one principle should be clear. No one is above the law. That includes presidents and former presidents. It certainly includes Donald Trump. And so I'm hopeful that at least 5 justices on the Supreme Court will make the right decision so we can proceed in a manner consistent with the framers of the Constitution, who broke free from a monarchy to create something different, a nation anchored in the rule of law.
Leader Jeffries, to get to the stakes of this upcoming election, there is a new ad from the Biden-Harris campaign. It was released this Friday, and it really tries to draw this contrast. Take a look.
Suckers and losers. On January 6th, we were respected all over the world. They're taking black jobs. I put 3 great Supreme Court justices on the court, and they happened to vote in favor of killing Roe v. Wade. It's been a great thing. My retribution is going to be a success.
So much to choose from there, Leader Jeffries, but why don't we start with the concept of a black job? What does that mean to you?
I have no idea, but we know that Donald Trump is the quintessential racial arsonist. He can't help himself. And so sometimes he tells on himself, and that occurred on Thursday. What I do know as well is that under the leadership of President Joe Biden, We've seen record job creation for the American people, including for African American women and men across the board. We've seen record investment in historically black colleges and universities and Hispanic serving institutions. And we've seen record creation of small business and entrepreneurial opportunities. So President Joe Biden and Democrats have an expansive view of an economy that works for everyone. And that includes the opportunity, of course, to be part of the middle class and to go beyond the middle class.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.